Hello and welcome to Reportage with Danish bin Nabi. My today's guest is a close confidant of Gandhi family, Mr. Wajahat Habibullah. I shall have a discussion with him about his recently released book, My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy, which is published by Westland Publication. Let's listen into Mr. Wajahat Habibullah. Mr. Wajahat Habibullah, at the start of your book, you have said that you have extensively quoted Maulana Azad because of his political thought. And you also go on to write that Jinnah is getting more space than Azad in the present political thought. Can you please elaborate a bit about it?
Well, as I see it, there were two major trends in Islamic thought that developed through the centuries in India. One trend, of course, was the one that finally resulted in the partition of the country. But there was another trend, which I think underlay the very basis of the theoretical framework of the Indian Union, what became the Indian Union in 1947. And the quotation from Maulana Azad, as you will have seen, from 1940. That means right on the eve of freedom, and therefore, in my view, paging the way of that India was to develop and how it was to develop into this multi-ethnic, multi-religious entity, which we all see in emergence now. But the reason why I have quoted it to start with in the book is because, as you notice inside the book, many contradictions began to arise, which were challenges faced by Mr. Rajiv Gandhi when he was Prime Minister, and being in his office in charge of minorities' welfare, they were also confronted by me of this kind of dilemma between the fact that these different trends of thought really govern the thinking of Muslims and the attitude of people other than Muslims towards Muslims, which also, of course, colored my judgment and colored my mind. That is why I felt that was important as an introduction of the book, in the prelude, to explain my position, my stand.
Do you think Maulana Azad is more relevant than Jinnah in today's India?
Naturally, in today's India, Maulana Azad is the relevant authority because I said the way India has developed is on the lines that Maulana Azad had conceived. Jinnah's concept led to the partition of the country, and that is now another country. And now I will not comment on what has become of that country, which of course did not last out as a unified entry for very long, but and is now faced with its own dilemmas, which it has to face. But now we wish them well, they're another country. So far as India is concerned, this conflict continues to plague us even to this day. As we know, there are those who talk of the Muslims of India being not quite Indian, or not being Rashtra Bhakt, or so on. Now, this this conflict is entirely in contradiction to what I see as India's heritage.
But then why there is a little research done on Maulana Azad in present day India? We see very few books written on him.
Where I have quoted from is the work by Sayyida Hamid, who is a leading intellectual in India. Sayyida Hamid is the daughter of Sayyid then, who was education apostle in the time of Jawaharlal Nehru. So there are others who have studied that, but now the question is that the political environment has moved beyond the times of Maulana Azad and so on. And the question is that the clergy is often accused of being against progress, against development. The debate has been going on, on this question of triple talaq and so on. But Maulana Azad was from the clergy. He was a Maulana, and one has to read him. I would agree with you that further studies, and he was India's first education minister, also, so the Indian education infrastructure existed. In India, the framework was laid by Maulana Azad. So I would agree with you that he deserves to be further studied, and I'm glad that certain people are doing it. But of course, the question of how much they do it is a question of how much demand there is. So people like you can clamor for more research and studies on the legacy of Maulana Azad.
Then you also write that your first preferred choices in 1968 were Assam preferred posting choices were Assam and Jammu and Kashmir. Why was it so?
Yes, preferred assignment. At that time, you were expected to opt for a particular state. I didn't want to opt for UP. And my placing in the civil services would have qualified me because a certain number of places are reserved in each state for insiders who opt for the state in those days. But would have qualified me for UP. But my mother was, as I mentioned, a very active politician and a leading politician in UP in those days. Later on, she was to become a minister in the cabinet of Kamlapati Tripathi. Now, I felt I was joining the civil service. I wanted to be as far away from any appearance at being politically, under pressure or politically aligned, because I did believe that and I still believe that for an administrator to be truly effective, he cannot cow down or bow down to a particular party alignment. Political, yes, there's an overall the commitment to democracy is very much part of my infrastructure. But for alignment towards any political party, yes, it has to be strictly avoided. And I felt that this would be best done. Now, why Assam and J&K? In fact, Assam was my first choice. Both states, I felt from my studies, were backward in many respects and required the attention of development and progress. They were backward not only economically, but backward also in terms of internal conflict and so on. Now, I felt that I could be of use in these two states. A&K did not have an internal conflict in terms of its own people, but it was, as you realize, it has been for years, the focus of international confrontation. So I felt I could be of use either in Assam or in Kashmir in strengthening the Indian state, in strengthening and helping the people of those states to stand up for their rights and actually enjoy all the liberties of India's democracy.
You have also written about Farooq Abdullah and Indira Gandhi's bitterness after the election of 1983 in the state. Then you go on to write that you were convinced that it was because of Mufti Muhammad Said. Can you elaborate about this chaotic relationship between Farooq Abdullah and Indira Gandhi?
Well, you recall that I have also quoted the Farooq Sahib himself in having spoken to me about the confrontation, well, not really a confrontation, the meeting between Farooq Sahib and Mrs. Gandhi when Mrs. Gandhi visited Leh after Operation Blue Star. I happened to be accompanying her there. And she had visited Leh for the reason that I mentioned. There was a large section of
Six soldiers.
and she wanted to speak to them. Six soldiers stationed in Leh, and she wanted to speak to them. She wanted to address them. She realized the distress of the community after Operation Blue Star. But then Farooq Sahib made a request to visit to call on her because the Prime Minister of the country was visiting his state, so he wanted to call on her. He wanted to receive her,
and he was advised against that, not to receive her, but still he went ahead.
She had been told not. She had been the Prime Minister's office had already told him that it was not necessary for him to come. So he made it. He told me about it. He arrived. He'd come to Leh, and he was in fact not even staying in the circuit house. He was staying with Mr. Marker, who was the then Deputy Commissioner, District Development Commissioner, and he asked to see her. And he told me that please arrange it. So I spoke to her, and in fact, afterwards she told me I wouldn't have seen him had you not told me. Now I didn't know what happened in that meeting. I do know. Sorry. I do know that he came out to that meeting, looking not very happy, but he said, "Thank you for having arranged it." But then he told me very recently. In fact, I spoke to him on the telephone when he was himself under house arrest, and he told me that yes, the meeting was not really a meeting because she gave him with the words he used as used there. She went up the wall. She was furious, and she told him a great deal about various things and misunderstandings that developed between them in a very accusatory fashion. Now I do know that the person who was closely in touch with her, and he had, in fact, in the 1983 election, he accompanied her on her tour everywhere. I had also gone there, and I've described it in detail because I was traveling with her on most of the trip in her car. But very often, Mufti Sahib would also be traveling with her. And he was very bitterly opposed not only to Farooq Sahib, but also to Farooq Sahib's father before him, that is Sheikh Abdullah. And he had then been talking. Farooq Sahib himself, when he spoke to me, he said he didn't know who had briefed Mrs. Gandhi to tell him all the kinds of things that he told him. But I did discover that many of those things had been told to Mrs. Gandhi by Mufti Sahib.
So, what actually? So, what was the actual role of Mufti Saab in all this scenario that was building up between the two?
Well, in the confrontation that took place and the misunderstanding that developed between Farooq Abdullah and Mrs. Gandhi, partly the fault lay in Farooq Sahib himself, in the sense that he was not probably open enough with Mrs. Gandhi. I can't tell, but she felt that he comes and he tells me something and then he does something else. Uh, so, so if he'd made some promises to her and didn't keep, I don't know of those. But if that is the case, then that would have, of course, antagonized her. And then, on the other hand, Mufti Sahab, and that is well known, was the political rival of Farooq Abdullah, and he was a part of Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet. So he would be the sort of person who would be having access to the Prime Minister, and she would often naturally speak to him. So of the Kashmiri leadership, I didn't know that he was the one who had easiest access to her. He and of course Arun Nehru himself was a Kashmiri, but not a Kashmiri in the sense that he was a UP Kashmiri, but he had a very good relationship with Mufti Saeed also.
Sir, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. I thought the connection might got dropped. Mr. Wajahat Habibullah, then you were also the part of that entourage of 30th October 1984, which was Indira Gandhi's last election rally, which you had written in Orissa. But she seemed very tired, and you were one of the few people who visited her in that hotel room on the instructions of the then Chief Minister of Orissa, J.B. Patnaik. Can you please? I don't think it was the hotel. It was at the Raj Bhavan, Orissa Raj Bhavan.
Yes, Orissa Raj Bhavan, where we were staying.
Yes.
And yes, she'd been out. It was not an election tour, but she had made a number of public speeches, including that famous and very prophetic speech which I've quoted. And that night, what was remarkable, and I've mentioned this in my book also, she had the capacity, probably because of her yoga practice, of being able to sleep very easily for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, a nice deep sleep, and then awake completely refreshed. But on that evening, and as you say, there was an exhibition scheduled for the Sambhalpuri sari
exhibition.
Yes, by Mr. Patnaik, and it had, of course, the choicest sari. And I bought a sari for myself, which is still with me. But he had expected Mrs. Gandhi to come and inaugurate that. So PM, then I went to her room and knocked on the door and said, then she opened the door and she looked very, very tired. For the first time, I saw her looking very, very tired. And she said that, no, I'm tired. even if she had been tired earlier, she would never really admit to being tired. But in this occasion, she said, "No, I'm tired. I can't come." And that is why I thought the reason why I mentioned it in my book is because I had never seen her look tired before. Yes, but she was tired. It had been a hectic visit. But as I mentioned in my book, it was not the hectic nature of the visit that had tired her, because it was really common with her to travel so fast and quickly from one place to another, across the country, in fact. But on this occasion, she had been tired. And I think because, and also as comes out from her speech itself, in her speech also, it had been a very emotional speech. And I think a great deal had come out of her in simply making that statement.
Coming to your friend Rajiv Gandhi, how different was he than his mother?
His mother and he, of course, there were so many similarities, but the difference was that she was a politician of the old school, a leader, a person who would expect to be listened to and not spoken, not told, except when she asked for advice. Rajiv, on the other hand, was very much more open. He expected people to advise him. He was looking for ideas all the time. And he'd pick up ideas where he got them from. Now, some people, in fact, in another interview, Mr. Prabhu Chawla asked me, he said that कुछ लोग कहते थे कि कान के कच्चे हैं, because he used to listen to everyone. It's not that he was कान के कच्चे. It was he, yes, would have an open mind. You could approach him easily, and I've given the example of the Consumer Protection Act. What were the origins? Vijay Dhar, who is from our JNK, is the one who was traveling with Sam Pitroda sometime, and Sam Pitroda, learning that he knew Rajiv Gandhi, asked to be introduced, and Rajiv readily met him. And we know the history of that meeting with Sam Pitroda, how that developed. So this was the kind of person that he was.
But
No, in fact, if I may just finish, the concrete example of this was that Mrs. Gandhi, and I noticed this because in meetings, cabinet meetings, other meetings, Mrs. Gandhi would speak very little. She would listen a great deal. She would be open to ideas, not that she was not open to ideas, but she would keep making her notes. Then in the end, she would make her what were called recommendations, suggestions. They were supposed to be simply suggestions, but in fact, they were orders. Because when she made that suggestion, nobody then spoke after. Those were orders. In the case of Rajiv, he'd actively participate in the meeting, and he'd ask questions he himself knew to be provocative because he expected to be contradicted. This is a completely different management style. In the initial stages, people didn't understand that. They said the prime minister said so that is his view. But then I have to explain how I try to dispel that view in my rather humble capacity.
do you think he was kept in dark by his close people on the important issues like the Operation Brass Track, like Babri Masjid, unlocking of Babri Masjid? In fact, you have been criticized on both the issues.
My friend Karan Thakur has written about this also. The impression, if I've created the impression that he did not know about the plan to open the locks in Babri Masjid, he did not know about Operation Brass Tack, that's wrong. Obviously, these things have been discussed in Operation Brass Tack, a major operation which engulfed the whole of North India.
But you have written he only came to know about the operation from the commander of Western Wing.
Yes. What I wanted to say was that critical decisions in regard to these operations were kept from him. And I have continued to regard this as a kind of betrayal. Yes, because he told me on the question of the Babri Masjid, he told me himself when I spoke to him. We were on a flight to Gujarat for drought relief. He said that he had not known about it. Not only that, he said that meddling in places of religious worship was wrong and should never be done. You know that in 1991, then Narasimha Rao had passed a bill and a law with regard to the religious institution. But at that time, there was no such law. Rajiv already was clear in his mind that that should never have happened. Similarly, in Operation Brass Tacks, when he realized the enormity of Operation Brass Tacks, and said almost within Pakistan and in India, there were feelings that as though India and Pakistan were about to go to war. And this was supposed to be a military exercise, which of course Rajiv had been, and I mentioned his having participated in earlier meetings and so on. But he, in fact, was furious. And a fallout of that was his reaction to questions regarding the foreign secretary who had recently been on a visit to Pakistan. I mentioned that in the book. There also has been much conjecture that why did he suddenly say that? And I've tried to explain why he said that. It was wrong. It was something wrong to have addressed the foreign secretary, a highly respected person, in that way. But the reason why he did it, I understood, and I've tried to explain that in my book.
Let's come to the present day politics. Do you think there are similarities between Rahul Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi?
Of course, there are similarities. He is Rajiv's grandson. He is his attitudes are similar to Rajiv's, and I don't think has tried to build upon Rajiv's political ideology in any way. He's trying to promote the same ideology. So similarities are there.
Do you think Rahul Gandhi is misfit for the politics?
I
Because his father also
that is what
yes,
you are
yes,
asking me
yeah.
is a personal opinion about the son of a very good friend of mine. Now you can understand that whatever opinion I will give you will be a colored opinion. It will not be a neutral opinion. I don't think he's a political misfit. I think he is somebody who is trying to learn. But you yourself are aware of the debate that has been taking place in this matter. And as I said, my view of Rahul Gandhi is deeply colored by the fact that he is the son of a very good friend of mine and Mrs. Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, with whom I have worked closely also when she was chair of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. So I prefer really not to answer that because in any case, whatever answer I give you will not be a neutral answer.
It will be a biased one.
It will be. It will be.
How close do you think is Priyanka's brand of politics to that of her grandmother, Indira Gandhi?
Politics has completely changed from that time to this. As I told you, Mrs. Gandhi's politics was politics. She herself was a political leader of the old school. Now there's a completely different type of politics. So far as Mrs. Gandhi was concerned, she became prime minister and leader of her party at a time when the party was a dynamic, forward-looking, ruling entity in the country. The challenge before Priyanka is to try and rebuild a party which has recently reached the lowest point of its power and function. So obviously, naturally, Priyanka is the grandson of Mrs. Gandhi. So as people, there are a lot of similarities between her and her father, between her and her grandma. But in politics, I cannot think of any great. I cannot think of uh, any similarities in dealing with the issues that are before them.
Mr. Wajahat Habibullah, my last question. Do you think Rajiv Gandhi would have been a different prime minister had he won the second term?
I do think so, and I think I've mentioned that also in my book. The point is that many ideas crystallized during the time he was no longer prime minister. Also, he was leader of the opposition for 5 years. Not 5 years, I think it was fewer than 5 years. He gave over power in 89, and then the elections were in 21. So it was a few years, 2 years. But he was he had become aware of a different view of his own policy, and he was quite aware of the mistakes that he had made. He was not hesitant with those mistakes he's made. I think I mentioned it also in my book about things which he felt he had done wrong. Now, therefore, if he'd come back with the greater political experience that he acquired in his earlier phase, I have mentioned that he was a political novice. He was more polished as a politician by 1991. He'd seen it from both sides, from being in a position of authority and from being in the opposition. And I met him a number of times when he was in the opposition, very often in the company of Farooq Abdullah, who was, of course, again, not chief minister during that time, but I was also serving in the state of J&K at that time. And from his conversations, it was quite apparent that he had learned from his mistakes, and he was able to see his mistakes because of the fact that he'd been out of power for long enough to be able to look at issues from a different perspective altogether.
Are there any possibilities of one more book on Jammu and Kashmir from your side?
I've already written a book on Jammu and Kashmir, and I agree it's a little old. My Kashmir, the dying of the light.
Yes, I am talking of a second book on Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I've already written one. Let me see if I can, if there's something I can write about. I have not been in J&K. Of course, I've been in touch with J&K all the time, and I'm still very much in close touch with J&K. People who are serving there, your chief secretary, they have been people who I have worked with earlier and who have been very dear to me. And in fact, Mr. Subramaniam, who is your chief secretary these days, was my favorite deputy director. I hope his colleagues are not annoyed by my having said so. He was my favorite deputy director when I was director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration. So I am aware of what has been happening in J&K in all these years. And yes, maybe I will write about it again. But let's see.
Mr. Wajahat Habibullah, pleasure talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.